Assuming Hubbard was lying, Dianetics, not Scientology, was a brilliant lie. Tad's blog. Advertisement. Advertisement. Dianetics, the modernly framed pseudoscience of mental health. Before engaging with L. Ron Hubbard's 1950 theory as presented in Dianetics, the modern science of mental health, we must first correct the most common public misrepresentations of its claims. Most critics, often relying on hearsay, internet summaries, or their understandable revulsion toward Scientology, fail to describe the theory on its own terms. Whether the theory is true, plausible, or complete fiction is one question. But misrepresenting what was actually proposed only muddies the analysis. Correction number 1. Dianetics does not claim the subconscious as the real self. Many critics of pop psychology assume that Dianetics simply rehashes Freudian notions. A repressed unconscious, a Freudian id or shadow self driving irrational behavior. Hubbard actually introduces a different system. He splits the mind not into ego, id, and superego, but into the analytical mind and the reactive mind. The analytical mind is rational, calculating, and in theory perfect. The reactive mind, meanwhile, records experiences of pain and unconsciousness and replays them in ways that control behavior without the person's knowledge. It is this second mind, formed not from repression but from trauma recorded while unconscious, that Dianetics targets for erasure. Correction number 2. Hubbard never claimed the engram was a memory you could consciously recall. The central concept of the Dianetics theory is the engram, a complete, literal recording of everything that happened during moments of pain and unconsciousness. These are not remembered normally. They exist below conscious recall, but according to Hubbard, can still influence a person's physical or emotional responses. A person might have no idea they are being re-stimulated by a sound or phrase that was present during an earlier injury or illness. This idea is distinct from typical traumatic memory. It is more akin to a perfect phonographic recording of your sensory environment while knocked out. Correction number 3. Dianetics was not originally spiritual or religious. The original book is pitched explicitly as a scientific and medical breakthrough. No mention of reincarnation, aliens, or gods. The early movement discouraged belief in the supernatural. Only later, when Dianetics floundered financially and organizationally, did Hubbard pivot to Scientology, a new religious movement with cosmic stakes and reincarnated souls. But in 1950, he was offering an aggressive empirical claim that trauma, as recorded engrams, caused everything from neurosis to asthma, and that a precise mental technology could erase it. Now, assuming Hubbard was lying. Let's be clear, the evidence against Dianetics is overwhelming. There's no independent confirmation of engrams. Auditing doesn't withstand scientific scrutiny. There are no blind trials, no peer-reviewed journals, no mechanism beyond metaphor. But this is not an article about whether Dianetics is true. This is an article about what it would mean if it were a deliberate fabrication, a lie with a blueprint. And what a brilliant lie it would be. The lie was systematic, modular, and scalable. Unlike many charismatic con games or pseudo-therapies, Dianetics proposed a fully internalized system. It did not require drugs, rituals, chanting, or groupthink, at least not at the start. It required only a listener, auditor, a set of protocols, and a cooperative subject. Its principles were rule-based, a kind of amateur psychosurgery performed via language. This made it modular, a therapist's toolkit for the masses, simplified and systematized. Think of it as Freudianism without the Latin or Jung without the dream dictionaries. If you wanted to create a system that felt scientific and egalitarian but still promised transformation and power, Dianetics was perfect. The lie was strangely prescient of later psychology. If Dianetics were simply pseudoscience, we'd expect it to be quickly eclipsed by better ideas and disappear. But strangely, pieces of it have resurfaced, not as doctrines, but as parallel insights in newer, evidence-based psychologies. These echoes don't validate Hubbard's methods or conclusions, but they do raise an eyebrow about what he managed to intuit, fabricate, or synthesize from his surroundings. 1. Restimulators and modern triggers are conceptual cousins. Hubbard's idea of a restimulator, a stimulus that unconsciously activates an engram, is functionally identical to what modern trauma psychology calls a trigger. A sound, word, smell, or situation reactivates a traumatic memory, causing a cascade of irrational, intense emotions. In Hubbard's model, this isn't metaphorical, it's literal. The mind is playing back the trauma like a recording. While mainstream science rejects the exact mechanism, the behavioral outcome is virtually the same. That resemblance isn't a coincidence. Dianetics was, in some ways, an early populist theory of trauma encoding and reactivation, albeit dramatized and mechanized. 2. Primary process thinking mirrors the reactive mind. The Freudian concept of primary process thinking, irrational, associative, dreamlike mental activity often linked with childhood or psychosis, describes a mental mode very close to Hubbard's reactive mind. When in a state of restimulation, the subject isn't reasoning, remembering, or abstracting. They're reacting with pure emotion and sensory association. Language gets strange. Logic disappears. They behave like an animal in trauma, not a human in reason. To someone unaware of this connection, it may seem like Hubbard invented this model. In truth, he simply translated Freudian abstraction into a mechanical metaphor, again, using the language of cybernetics and systems. 3. The real twist. Language creates the problem. This is where Hubbard takes a leap very few of his contemporaries made, and one that still places Dianetics in a weirdly high theory territory. He claims engrams become dangerous only after the development of language. That is, animals experience pain and unconsciousness, but it doesn't haunt them, because they don't record semantic content. Only humans can be triggered by words or word-like sounds and engrams. This effectively makes Dianetics a theory of trauma mediated by language, not just pain. And here's where it gets interesting. That's also the core of Lacanian psychoanalysis. Lacan famously argued that the unconscious is structured like a language. It isn't raw sensation or Freudian drives alone, it's symbolic. Words define and distort desire. Trauma becomes inescapable precisely because it is encoded in language, a symbolic trap we are born into and cannot escape. In this light, Dianetics is a strange hybrid, part abreaction therapy, reliving trauma to discharge it, and part proto-Lacanian semiotics. Hubbard doesn't invoke the mirror stage or the symbolic order, but his insistence that words themselves trap and trigger the subject echoes Lacan's darkest insights. If he was lying at a structuralist level. 4. Analytical versus reactive is still a fresh framework. Even without the metaphysics, Hubbard's core framing, the struggle between analytical and reactive modes, still resonates. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, rational emotive therapy, internal family systems, IFS, and metacognition-based models all involve interrupting a reaction and replacing it with reflection, reinterpretation, or reappraisal. The language has changed. The models have evolved, but the structure remains. Some part of you is being hijacked, and another part must wake up and take the reins. By stripping away Freud's id, ego, superego and replacing it with a binary of clarity versus restimulation, Hubbard achieved a kind of user-friendly reduction. In modern terms, he framed mental health as executive function versus impulsive scripts. In that framing alone, he may have been decades ahead of mainstream psychology. The lie used the language of science to bypass scientific gatekeeping. Hubbard borrowed from the language of engineering, mathematics, and cybernetics. Clear was not just a spiritual achievement, it was the mind with all engrams erased, a stable, optimized system. The reactive mind was described like a malfunctioning processor, a logic-breaking subroutine triggered by random noise. By couching his theory in these terms, feedback loops, exact recall, permanent cures, Hubbard got around the cultural resistance to mysticism and faith healing. Instead of promising spiritual salvation, Dianetics promised mental hygiene, emotional health, and even perfect memory. This was not the language of preachers or philosophers. It was the language of engineers. In post-war America, that sold. The lie promised infinite improvement with zero magic. This is what sets Dianetics apart from nearly every pop psychology and New Age movement of its time. No magic was required. No crystals, no chakras, no talking to dead relatives. The clear was not a mystic, but a normal person finally operating at full capacity. Supposedly, anyone could get there with time, effort, and the book. And that is the most seductive lie of all, that you could heal completely, permanently, and rationally. No murky unconscious forces beyond your reach. No endless therapy. Just a finite number of sessions, a checklist, and an endpoint. In a culture obsessed with self-improvement and terrified of mental illness, this lie had legs. The lie was built for evangelism. Hubbard didn't just design a theory, he designed a user experience. He created a system where users became teachers. Auditing was meant to be reciprocal. You audit me, I audit you. Each person is simultaneously a patient and a healer. Each success story becomes a recruiter. This turns Dianetics into a viral system. Not quite a cult yet, but a network of belief and behavior, where participation validates the system and produces more participants. And unlike Freudian psychoanalysis, it's cheap, fast, and scalable. If it's a lie built to reproduce itself. The lie got people off the couch and into action. Critics often underestimate how disempowering post-war psychiatry and psychology were. You were sick, and the doctor told you what to do. Pills, electroshock, analysis, hospitalization. You didn't question it. You didn't do anything but submit. Dianetics flipped that. It told you. Greater than, your mind is fixable. You're not sick. You've been hurt. And you can heal yourself, with help. Even as a con, that's a radical inversion of the psychiatric power structure. A brilliant lie tells you you're the hero in a world that said you were broken. Epilogue. The modernly framed pseudoscience of mental health. In the end, Dianetics may be best remembered not as science, or even as religion, but as what it accidentally was. A modernly framed pseudoscience of mental health. It borrowed the jacket of science, the momentum of therapy, and the moral promise of religion, without fully belonging to any of them. If Hubbard was lying, it wasn't a delusion. It was an innovation, a seductive fusion of trauma theory, semiotics, behaviorism, and myth. He was wrong, but wrong in a way that pointed forward, not backward. Plenty of liars exploit their marks. Few build an entire mental operating system, convince millions to install it, and still manage to predict the language of psychology 70 years early. That's not science. That's not prophecy. That's marketing genius, disguised as a cure.